Hello, my name's Amanda and welcome to my first tutorial for 2016. So what I'm going to show you how to make today is something very easy and I think quite straightforward, and it is a pieced apron. Now I'm calling it a pieced apron because it's made in three stages, in three pieces. Each piece or each section are very easy to piece together, and then at the end they all come together to make our very lovely apron. So the fabrics that I've used for this apron are from a new range by RJR Fabrics, and the range is called In the Kitchen by Patrick Luce, and I just think some of these prints are some of the most gorgeous, sweetest kitchen-y type prints that I've seen in quite a while. So when I was asked to make a few things out of them, I said yes because I love them a lot. Now before I get into showing you how to make this apron, I just want to let you know that there is no print out pattern for this tutorial. Everything that you will need to know is down in the description box below. I've also written a very detailed blog post all about how to make this apron, so there you'll be able to find out all of the different fabrics that you need, where you can buy these fabrics, and just really everything that you'll need to know to make this apron if you would like to make it yourself. So with all of that said, this is how you make this fun little pieced apron. To make this apron, you will need to cut the following from each of these fabrics. For the top half, cut one 10" by 12" rectangle for the front, one 1 3/4 inch by 12" rectangle for the trim, one 3" by 26" rectangle for the neck loop, and one 11 1/4 inch by 12" rectangle for the lining at the back. Then for the pocket, cut one 6" by 12" rectangle and one 1 3/4 inch by 12" rectangle for the front, and then one 7 1/4 inch by 12" rectangle for the lining. And then finally for the bottom half of the apron, cut one 20" by 30" rectangle for the background, one 1 3/4 inch by 30" rectangle for the trim, two 3" by width of fabric strips for the apron ties, and then one 21 1/4 inch by 30" rectangle for the lining at the back. Beginning with the pieces from the top half, start by first making the neck loop. To do this, fold the piece in half lengthways and with right sides together, and sew a 1/4 inch seam down the open edge, making small back stitches at the beginning and end. Patiently pull the strip right side out using a chopstick to push the fabric through. Then using a medium to hot steamy iron, gently press the tube flat with the seam lying off to one side. Then carefully sew two top stitch lines along either side of this piece, as close to the edge as possible. Doing this will help the neck loop from rolling and twisting out of shape. Place the neck loop to one side and lay out the piece for the front top half of the apron and the trim that goes on top. Flip and pin the trim to the top edge, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along this side. Press the seam upwards towards the trim and then carefully sew a top stitch as close to the seam as possible. Next, lay out the back lining piece and place the neck loop on top, with its edges about 1/2 inch in from the sides of the lining. Place the front piece evenly on top, right sides facing, and pin the edges into place. Make sure to leave a 4 inch opening along the bottom edge so that it can be later turned out the right way. Starting on one side of the opening, make a small back stitch and sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side, taking your time as you sew over the thick parts of the neck loop. Then make another small back stitch when you reach the other side of the opening. With fabric scissors, trim off any excess fabric from the top and bottom edges and then snip the corners. Then carefully turn this section right side out through the opening, using a chopstick to push out the edges and corners. Evenly fold in the raw edges where the opening is, and then press it and the rest of the top half of the apron flat. Then at the sewing machine, sew a top stitch along each side as close to the edge as possible. And that is the top half of the apron completed. To make the pocket, lay out the front piece with its trim along the top edge. Flip and pin the trim into place and then sew a 1/4 inch seam down this side. Press the seam outwards towards the trim and then sew another top stitch close to the seam edge just like before. Next, lay the pocket piece on top of the lining, right sides together. Pin the top edge into place and then with a plate measuring about 7 inches across, mark 2 quarter circles along the bottom corners with a lead pencil. Pin the rest of the edges together, again leaving a 4-inch opening along the bottom. Starting on one side of the opening, sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side, following the pencil line at each of the corners. Finish with a backstitch on the opposite side of the opening. Then trim down the rounded corners and carefully clip the seam allowance with thread snips. After clipping the 2 top corners, turn the pocket right side out and use a chopstick to push out the edges and corners. Evenly fold back the raw edges at the opening and then press the pocket piece flat with the iron. Then sew just one line of top stitch along the top edge of the pocket and place it to one side. To construct the bottom half of the apron, lay out the piece cut for the front and its trim along the top edge. Flip and pin the trim into place and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along this edge. Press the seam upwards towards the trim and then sew one more top stitch close to the seam's edge. Next, center the pocket piece on top of the apron, about 4 inches away from the top edge. Once happy with its placement, carefully pin it into place. Then starting along the right hand side, make a small back stitch and then slowly top stitch the pocket into place, finishing with another back stitch on the opposite side. Snip off the excess threads from the front and back and then move on to making the apron ties. To do this, fold the tie pieces in half and starting at the folded edge of each, make a small back stitch and sew a 1/4 inch seam along the bottom end and then up the full length of the ties. Finish with a back stitch and carefully snip the corners. Then very patiently turn each of the ties right way out using a chopstick to push out the fabric and corners. Press each tie flat with the iron and then top stitch along each side and across the ends to prevent them from twisting out of shape. Next, lay out the lining piece for this section and then place each of the ties facing inwards along either side, about 1/2 inch down from the top edge. Gently place the front of the apron on top, right sides facing, and securely pin the ties and each of the edges into place, making sure to leave a 4-inch opening along the bottom. Make a small back stitch on one side of the opening and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side of the apron. To finish, back stitch at the opposite side of the opening and then trim away any excess fabrics and snip off the corners. Pull the apron right side out through the opening and push out the edges and corners. Fold in the raw edges at the opening and then give it a good press with the iron. And then to sew everything together, lay out the top half of the apron and then place the other half on top so that they're just overlapping each other. Make sure the top of the apron is centered with the pocket and then pin it into place. Starting in a bottom corner, sew one last top stitch along each side of the bottom half of the apron. When you reach the part where the two pieces are overlapping, gently feed them through, taking the pins out as you go and making sure each piece is being evenly sewn together. Finish the top stitching with a small back stitch, snip off the excess threads, and that's your apron finished. Now of course, let me know if you're going to make this apron. I would love to know how you go with making it. As I said at the beginning, it is quite a simple apron to piece together, even though it may not look like that. I am really happy with the way that this apron turned out. I love the patchworky type nature to it and how I was able to use lots of different fabrics from the range to make this sort of one-off type apron that I can use when I'm baking or cooking or doing whatever, really. And before I go, I just want to say a big huge thank you to RJR Fabrics for so kindly sending me out this beautiful in the kitchen range. I absolutely love it, and I hope you do too, as well as the tutorials that I'm bringing out with this range. And with that, as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you another time very, very soon. Bye! And it is my Jacob's ladder quilt. So this quilt is made using some of the beautiful DS quilt fabrics that came out in 2012. I bought pretty much a ton of them because I absolutely